A quick message before we begin this week's show. I recorded it due to the time difference between Tasmania and London at about 5 a.m. my time, which means I may or may not have had the correct mic plugged in. And so the audio on my side of the conversation wasn't great. However, fortunately, you may say, fortunately and not fortunately, we live in the AI era. So James and I applied some AI processes to my voice, which means I sound clear. I just sound a little bit weird. And we decided that was the better move for this episode because the discussion's really powerful and you can't really capture that magic if you have to do a re-record. So that's my little notification before we begin the show. If I sound cyborg this week, it's because I kind of am. And that is the future we live in. On with the show. This week, we welcome to the show vlogger and commentator Angie Speaks. Now, Angie, we're going to do something a little bit different with the intros. I'm experimenting with them this year, and I either ask AI for an intro, or I attempt an intro and then get the guest to correct it. So I'm going to go with option number 2 for you. I'm going to introduce you. Angie is, as previously mentioned, a vlogger and political commentator based in the UK with a particular interest in where, shall we say, actual or classical left thought speaks to, interacts with, and falls away from spirituality, psychology, all that kind of stuff. And in general, this exploration, this output, is focused on culture and culture change, and frankly, watching some of your videos where culture disappoints you.
Yeah.
How is that?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's like probably the best summation of me and my work that anyone has done so far. Mine has been quite a complicated trajectory that's taken me into many paths and many worlds. So thank you very much for that. A very succinct summation of me. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good. Well, if there's nothing to correct there, which is rare, so yay me, then I'm just gonna move on to the traditional first question. Angie, were you a weird kid?
Yes, I've waited so long for you to ask me that question. But I've definitely enjoyed a lot of what some of your previous guests have discussed, and also see like a major, I guess, through line between people who are drawn to sort of mystical occult ideas and weird childhoods. And yeah, I was definitely a weird kid. I grew up in a very kind of traditional Nigerian Christian conservative home. But because my family are Yorubas, there was always this kind of undertone of like the mystical kind of haunting our daily life. Women going off into corners and discussing dreams, talks of spell work, all of this stuff that kind of seemed to be under the surface of like the Christianity that my family practiced. And it kind of acted as like a gateway drug for me into the weird and the mysterious. And yeah, as a kid, I was constantly in books, had my nose in a book, was kind of socially weird, preferred the company of ghosts and fairies to other children. And yeah, I guess anything religious or mystical or spiritual deeply appealed to me when I found it in movies, even some of the things that I learned at church. I kind of developed a weird fascination with eschatology, which led me down some weird rabbit holes. And yeah, I guess a lot of my gateway into being interested in spirituality kind of came from the background in Christianity that I had. Ironically, the sort of mystical and the Christian didn't have that like major separation for me growing up because of the syncretism of my family's belief systems. And I also, another weird kind of, I guess, branch out of that was that my interest in mysticism kind of led me into, I guess, explorations of the zeitgeist, which then led to my interest in politics. So my interest in politics and social commentary definitely is an outgrowth of my interest in mysticism, because I see the two things as being linked in a very kind of profound way that often gets overlooked.
It definitely gets overlooked, especially on the left. But that was, in fact, going to be one of my questions for later on. Which one came first, the spirituality or the politics? Because you can end up in different places depending on which one comes first, right? But before we get to
Mhm.
that, so talking about a Nigerian Christian upbringing, was that in Nigeria or Nigerian community in the UK? Because there's a very different relation. Well, the stories, particularly in a London context, mean that you might have bumped up against different understandings of witchcraft and so on in a diaspora versus back home. But like, talk to us about that.
So it was a mixture of both because I spent my earlier kind of years in Nigeria and I was primarily with my grandma at the time who had this weird cognitive dissonance where she was constantly in church raising holy hands and praying for a better fortune, but also whenever trouble came, she would run to the witch doctor. and
Sounds like a smart woman.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But it's quite common in Nigerian culture for that to be the case. And I remember being young and like she had like a shop and there was like a this weird object in her shop, like a charm of some sort, and like the whenever thieves would come, it was supposed to like put them under a trance and they would like pick up the broom and start sweeping basically, and then the only way that they could be knocked out of that is if the owner of the shop came to claim and protect their property. So just seeing weird little things like that kind of piques my interest as a kid. And also water was a major motif too. There was always this fear of water, this like kind of folklore about water spirits and mami water, and deities that like haunted sacred bodies of water. And I guess that really also piqued my imagination, but it was also kind of forbidden, which is what I guess made it more attractive because of the sort of Christian rooting and foundation. And then when I came to the UK as a kid and, was involved in the sort of diaspora community, I kind of, I guess, got taken back into my roots through the information that was preserved by the diaspora. Because because of the influence of Christianity and Islam in Africa, a lot of the belief systems of our past are viewed as demonic or as a form of primitive daimonism that's like a recess of the past. So even people who aren't necessarily religious see it as like archaic. And the reservoirs of Yoruba belief systems are really in places like South America, in the reservoirs of African American culture, in what has been preserved in the diaspora. So I ended up learning about my heritage through engaging with the knowledge of the diaspora while still kind of having that rootedness in the old ways through my experiences. So it's been this weird kind of like between two worlds, attempting to kind of piece together fragments.
I'm really interested in that as a almost universal observation, and it comes back to where, in the right hands, left critiques can be illuminating. So
Mm-hmm.
the idea, like we can make a very clear and insightful post-colonial or decolonial take about the internalization of an empire model so that people dismiss their own pasts as savage or primitive, right? Because the same thing happens in the Philippines. Like I was just there. It happens everywhere where there's been an impact. And particularly if there is a colonizer belief system that comes with it, like a Christianity, those of us that have the benefit, albeit questionable, of access to left critiques can kind of see something very illuminating, which is like, okay, cool. You're still in relation to your indigenous beliefs. It's just that we might say, not doing it in the healthiest possible way because of the impact of a system that's got in the way of it, right? Like in the Philippines, it was the people of Siquijor in particular were really looked down on as like proper savages by the rest of the
Mm.
Philippines because the native beliefs were still stronger or still more evident there than elsewhere. And so even though they're no longer scared of them as witches, which was like a mid 20th century thing, like they would avoid the island, now they're just seen as backward or primitive. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like there's something about that that isn't entirely universal, but there's something about that that you can see in especially diaspora situations, but not always. Just like in a post-colonial context, you can kind of see like, this is disappointing in a way that people have internalized that. Yeah, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. But there's a lot of nuance to it too, because I also have to accept the fact that I am a Westerner. Like last summer, I went back to Nigeria with my boyfriend, and it was the first time I had been back since I was about 13 years old. I'm now 29, so it had been a while. And in my mind, I had always sort of viewed myself as like a Nigerian, and that it was like, and it is a big part of me. But this time round, I had to really kind of confront the fact that I'm a Westerner in my mind, in my, paradigm, in the way that I think, in my customs, in my cultural framing. Like, I'm a Westerner because this is where I've spent the majority of my life. And the way that I engage with these things that I view as my indigenous roots are also through the vantage point of a Westerner. And I just kind of had to accept that that's the case. And there's nothing wrong with that. Mine is a unique perspective because it's kind of a reconciliation of opposites. It's a blending of two worlds. But I do have to understand those worlds as distinct and respect their distinctiveness, while also understanding the universals and like the congruency like between them. And yeah, like when it comes to the sort of post-colonial search for spirituality, I think that that's like the best kind of vantage point to come at it from, one that like recognizes your experience as unique and distinct, rather than trying to slot it into like
Yeah.
by force a cultural context in which you're actually kind of alien. And that's what I had to kind of embrace and realize, is that yeah, despite the fact that there's this sort of deep connection and understanding and almost intuitive grasp of certain things, I am still kind of alien to this. And I feel like that's kind of what the left doesn't, I guess, take into account a lot of the time, which
No.
is why it can be quite ham-fisted in its
Yes.
critiques of these sorts of cultural, I guess, collides and clashes. The accusation of cultural appropriation, all of that sort of stuff doesn't take into account like the complexity of the human experience and how it's not really easy to kind of neatly box and package things at times.
It's a naive essentialism either way, and most of the left critique would actually quietly, although if you push them on it, you trap them in a corner, would actually quietly agree with the internalized racism of savagery, because it contains that positivism, like actually that's all backwards and we should be moving into that fully automated luxury space communism, right? Like, so the
Yeah.
left contains this story of technological and cultural progress that it refuses to critique very well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's either does this naive essentialism where it's like, okay, well, you're from Nigeria, so you should have these beliefs, or
Exactly.
or it's kind of all right that you've left those beliefs behind because we should be focusing on material conditions and blah 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 blah, right? So it's one
Yeah,
of
yeah,
those.
yeah.
You kind of get it's
Yeah.
which when we talk about later on in the show. What I love so much about your work is you can be so informed about left critiques while still being disappointed by them, and that comes through in the videos. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is kind of demoralizing in a way, because there's the kind of cultural ego currently, especially on the left, is so rooted in its like idea that it has the moral high ground, that there's this like inability to self evaluate, or not even inability, just like lack of desire to self evaluate, to and anything that's like spiritual or esoteric or psychological is kind of viewed with derision and suspicion, which I think contributes to a lot of the alienation that we're currently
Yeah,
experiencing right now. And as somebody who's kind of been on the left and rejected pretty severely by the left, I guess what that did was it drove me inward and started to make me value my distinct experiences more. There's this weird push towards conformity. There's this weird kind of push to suppress anything that doesn't fit into these neat little boxes of identity and of cultural affiliation and of political affiliation. And I had to kind of come to terms with the fact that I'm the type of person who just can't think that way or identify that way because of my mixed cultural heritage, my mixed cultural backgrounds, the different kinds of political environments that I've been in. Like I said, I grew up in a conservative Christian family. And even though that had its downsides, I believe it also had its upsides in shaping elements of my character as well. And I've also grown up in like metropolitan liberal cities most of my life. I think that has its upsides, but it also has its downsides as well in terms of like being socially disembedded, alienation, not necessarily having roots. And my life has always been an attempt to kind of reconcile the positive elements of both of these experiences and find synthesis and like common ground. But yeah, we're in a climate currently where there is no room for that kind of approach. People are so driven towards fragmentation and kind of ego driven division. Yeah.
I definitely want to come back to that, because one of the things I've been thinking with of late is, and it's, we'll do it now, and then I want to talk more about the conservative Christian thing. But let's say going back to 2016, critiquing that was the Clinton-Trump election, and critiquing Clinton because she's a neoliberal warmonger, war criminal, and banker's stooge. So you'd always have to put this caveat, like, this isn't actually left, and then critique it, right? And I've realized in the last 6 or so years, I've given up on that, because the left has replaced left thinking with self-identifying as anything. So
Yeah.
if they want to call that left, I'm going to call that left and go in
Yeah.
on a critique on it. So when I say the left, I've been thinking of late of looking at it as if it was a shamanic healing client, because so much of what they're doing is a trauma response. And in a funny way, it almost rhymes with that internalized imperial racism, where it's like I am simply ignoring the call from my psyche. I am afraid of standing out because I'll be attacked. So it's actually behaving like a trauma victim, and in particular, having come out of the last 3 years utterly failing to do what it was supposed to do, which is observe and dismantle tyranny, and completely failing. Like they've got amnesia for the last 3 years. And I'm talking so-called proper left thinkers like Chomsky and so on, complete amnesia at how they've failed in the last 3 years. So I'm looking at them like a client. Like, you're traumatized and acting out your trauma, and it's really fascinating to watch, because, like, I don't know, it's when I'm in a good mood, I can think about them that way, which is you're a trauma victim. How does that sound to you?
Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and I mean, in a sense, they're not only a trauma victim, they're also kind of becoming the perpetrator in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
And this is what happens when the ego identifies with the good and the beautiful, and the ego says, "I am the good and the beautiful. I am the arbiter of the good and the beautiful. I am I'm the moral high ground." When the ego places itself in a position where it has no place to be, it has the capacity to create the opposite. It's like the persona creating shadows. And I feel like that's the major pathology of the left currently. And I mean, this happens on all sides of the political aisle. But whenever somebody says, "Hey, I'm the representative of good," it blinds them to their own capacity for evil. And this has happened throughout history, time and time again, in so many different political movements, so many different political moments. But what we're really seeing is almost like a mass formation psychosis occurring on the left, where conformity is being confused with solidarity, where this
submission,
sort of
even like submission and conformity, like it's
submission and conformity. Yeah, it's being confused with solidarity and like real social bonds. It's becoming very cult-like. We are kind of, it's not just the left. This is just a symptom of the zeitgeist as a whole, and it's kind of affecting everything. We're almost entering like a post-secular age in the sense where like the hunt for meaning is like given birth to all these new kind of godheads where people are attempting to find meaning, one of which is like politics, identity, race, even environmentalism has kind of become a new form of post-secular religion. Transhumanism is a form of post-secular religion. Sexual liberation is a new form of post-secular religion. all of even like the UFO kind of enthusiasm or whatever. That's another form of post-secular religion that's kind of bubbled up in this like Aquarian age that we're in right now. And yeah, I see this kind of fervor for political identity, this idea that one is the arbiter of the true and the good and the beautiful, as being a kind of false search for meaning, a false search for transcendence, a false search for numinosity in an otherwise kind of empty neoliberal like hellscape. So as much as I'm disappointed by the left, and I'm quite keenly aware of the pathologies of the left, I also understand where it's coming from.
For sure.
The soul, it's like a soul calling towards higher meaning that's kind of been perverted by the ego.
Yeah, see, I think this is like Connor and I would talk about this fairly regularly on the New Year's shows, where the right historically has been better at understanding that the cosmos is alive, that it is magical. Yeah. The left doesn't, but that feeling is still in people who identify as the left. And so it comes through as that really archonic demiurgic desire, that Morgoth Sauron desire. I have to make the world perfect because, you know, people are upset, people are poor. I have to make it perfect. And that sounds good, but that's literally what Sauron was trying to do. He was trying to perfect Middle-earth. And that is why it's so difficult to get the critique in, because the feeling comes from the right place, which is like, yes, bad things are happening on the earth. Kids are fucking dying of starvation, etc., etc. Like 100%. So you can't
terrible economic system. Like all of those things are true.
Yeah, exactly.
All of those things are true. Like, but the instinct has been perverted by the drives of the ego, and like unless something is done about it, it's going to lead to catastrophe. And I mean that in complete serious terms, and I'm saying it with my whole chest. Like, this isn't just some kind of fringe cultural malady. This is now. It's now institutional. It's in academia. It's in the arts. It's everywhere. It's in the conventions of the platforms that our media is inhabited on. Like, it's everywhere. This mentality, this kind of invaded culture, and it's kind of become a mimetic hazard. And like, as much as I am really about spirituality, the reason why I kind of entered into the political domain is because I feel like some of the tools that we have unearthed in our explorations are so useful for healing the zeitgeist. I feel like that's kind of our job as people who are spiritual, is to use some of that magic in a way that like helps heal the zeitgeist. And I'm so eager to like talk to and connect with other people who are like-minded in that way, because I feel like we're in emergency circumstances right now, and I don't think enough people are taking it as seriously as they should. Like, these are manifestations of an incredibly disturbed cultural psyche, and it's serious.
Yeah, it's absolutely serious. And you've been using, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show, Jungian terms. And Jung said, well, when he was asked, do you think we're going to end up in a nuclear conflagration? He says it depends on how many people actually manage to integrate their shadows. And that's not going great. So when you say it's a catastrophe, it's like, no, it's a catastrophe and a prediction with a 90% accuracy rate that this ends very poorly. That's what it is, right? Like it is a existential emergency, not a cultural fad like fidget spinners or Tamagotchi, right? Like it's something that a collective psyche has brought to the surface. I don't know what for. Like, it might be to cleanse itself. This actually might be, we're all doing this. That's what I mean. Like, when you say, because I'm very interested in this when it comes to people who I find inspirational, like Charles Eisenstein and so on, that now that he's joined RFK Jr.'s campaign, which is adorable and idealistic, it will do nothing, but it will do nothing observable on the level of material. But the RFK campaign is going to be around healing the divide, which I think is great. Except I think that moment has passed. And this is coming back to that healing thing. Like, are we actually in a rescue mission? Are we trying to get as many people onto lifeboats? Rather than like, okay, cool. In fact, we can intervene and bring healing that prevents the failure to integrate the shadow. Do you know what I mean? Like how White pill, black pill, how are you feeling?
It fluctuates for sure. It fluctuates, but to be honest, as an Aquarius, I'm like a chronic optimist. So I can't help but feel somewhat optimistic because I feel like it's a mixture of both. Like, I feel like during periods of like, mass formation psychosis, times where the collective psyche is like malfunctioning, you there's hope and solace in creating islands of sanity. So I think that, yeah, first of all, you do have to kind of do the rescue mission and get people onto the lifeboats, but then there is also medicine that, like, the things that we study and are enthusiastic about contain for the zeitgeist. And I feel like communicating that through art, through whatever it is like more important now than ever. I mean, we're in a time where people are feeling demoralized about things like art because of the advent of things like chat gbt and, like, mid journey, and people are afraid of human obsolescence, and messages of human obsolescence are constantly being bombarded in the media. I feel like now is the time more than ever to express elements of the human soul that are, like, being attacked. I think that the human soul is the answer to the problem, like expressing the human soul, even when under duress, when under coercion, telling the truth, being true to your perspective, being true to your convictions. I feel like it's going to get a lot harder to do that in the
Yeah.
coming periods, and I think now is the time to, like, really double down on getting to know yourself, getting to know the truth of who you are, getting straight with your convictions and expressing them with ultimate sincerity and conviction.
Yeah. Well, we both did that over the last few years, and I've done more pleasant things with my life. How is that? How is that for you? When you said, having the left come for you and then abandon you, when I'd watched your
Mm.
videos, you seemed, which is a compliment because I struggled with it personally, almost serenely, serenely unaffected by it. And is that because it does
Oh,
come from that? Does it come from that soul place? Because I would watch your videos going like, how is this bitch just like sailing through it?
that's so kind of you, but like I went through the desert big time and, like, found, like, my soul. It put me in contact with my soul, and I realized that it was almost like a trial. It's like,
Yeah.
my proximity to the left almost threatened to take me away from my soul. I found myself self-censoring. I
Yeah.
found myself trying to put myself into boxes where I didn't fit, trying to ignore my experiences, trying to not, for instance, like, I grew up in a conservative, like, Nigerian family, for instance. And despite the fact that I may disagree philosophically with family members, I still love them as people. And I still think that, in terms of lessons about resilience, in terms of lessons about community, family, respect, the importance of social embeddedness, these are lessons that I learned that have added a lot of value to my life, despite the fact that they came from a religious conservative
Yeah.
context. So in my mind, I don't hate people simply because that's the context that they came from. I still see the gold within, you know, the things that I may disagree with, maybe philosophically, culturally. That's just kind of, layers of persona that shroud soul, which is like
Yeah.
the real essence of people. And I kind of started to see how ideology and cultural affiliations and identities were getting in the way of people actually connecting soul to soul. And that's, like, what's important at the end of the day. And, like, it's so lacking currently in culture. In fact, the current culture that we inhabit actively incentivizes us not to have those transpersonal soul to soul experiences. We're trapped behind layers and layers and layers of persona, of this is my identity, these are my pronouns, this is my race, this is my gender, this is my this is why I'm different from you. Jung talks about, like, differentiation and how this is, like, the nature of man, like, our very nature as conscious beings, makes us differentiate the world. But when that mechanism, manifests through the ego instead of through the transcendent self, it causes havoc. And what we're seeing now is further fragmentation. We are now entering into a world where things are becoming more and more fragmented. Technology is also contributing to this fragmentation. And the more fragmented we get, the more we sink into oblivion. And that's kind of what awaits us at the end of this is oblivion, unless we do something to reassert the soul and the importance of the human soul and the sovereignty of the human soul beyond politics, beyond gender, beyond race, beyond cultural affiliation. And like my life experiences this like weird cultural mutt. It's like lived in many different cultural contexts and has been up and down the political spectrum has forced me to realize this truth. And it's come through pain, like the pain of being ostracized, of being pushed aside, of not belonging, of feeling like you're out in that desert, like by yourself. Unfortunately, all of us have to go there in order to find the substance of who we truly are. And I feel like the reason why people are gravitate towards these sort of cult-like group affiliations around identity and political ideology is because they're afraid of that process.
Yeah. They're running from that reckoning, 100%.
They don't want to know the substance of what makes them. They don't want to get to know like their qualities. And like the process of being ostracized by the left, of losing friendships, losing career prospects, basically being made a pariah, it made me a dangerous bitch. And like that's where my confidence comes from. It comes from within. It comes from God. It comes from me relinquishing my ego and realizing that there's something higher than me that's in control, and it's the same force that's in you, and it's the same force that's even in the people that like I disagree with. Like relinquishing my ego, my resentments, my desire for control, all of that stuff was kind of what I guess put me on this journey and made me able to withstand like the negativity and like the scrutiny and everything that comes along with aligning with your soul.
Yeah.
And I feel like now more than ever is the time to do that, because there are so many things that want your soul. Like now, like I say, we're in a post-secular age. There's so many ideologies, so many cults, so many different forms of warped spirituality, self-optimization doctrines, transhumanist delusions, you name it, that are like waiting to fill that void that people are feeling. And people are kind of swallowing it hook, line, and sinker because they're out of touch with themselves and they don't trust that there's something in them that's like greater than the limitations of their ego. And they want to disappear into a mass as well to avoid responsibility for the soul that they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that because I know I resonate with it a lot. Like I'm a dangerous bitch now too. Like that's all been burned off. Like I'm unstoppable in the sense that I'm unstoppable because the stuff that comes through me can't be stopped because I'm not powering it from the level of ego or the need to be right. It's that really Jungian idea, or Gospel of Thomas even, of bringing forth what is within you. And that was everyone has to go through it because that's just what happens down here on Earth. But yeah, we get to do it with a few more fireworks, I suppose.
Yeah, the depths will drag you whether you want to be dragged down into the depths or not. And like it happens on a personal level, but it also happens on a cultural level too. And I feel like on a cultural level right now, we're being dragged into our depths. And anytime these like major catastrophes occur, it's a collision with the depths, something that's undeniable, that forces us to confront our unconscious contradictions and really take a look in the mirror. And a lot more of those moments are yet to come, especially like with the acceleration of technology and the effect that that's going to have on the human condition, to changes in the economy, many of which aren't going to be for the positive, to looming wars, to all sorts of things that are on the horizon currently facing humanity, climate catastrophe, all of those things. These are kind of humbling confrontations with the depths. And even the sort of post-secular madness that we're seeing right now is also kind of the depths asserting themselves. Even the UFO mania we are seeing currently, I see it as like a form of the unconscious asserting itself. Our need for numinosity, our need for a connection to the divine asserting itself. And it's going to manifest in one way or another. Whether that's going to be positive or not is really up to us. But currently it seems as if our spiritual impulses are being led down some very dark and destructive paths.
Yeah. And people, and this, I want to come back to my main critique, I suppose, with the left is that it is a machine universe metaphor fundamentally. Outside of the few bits of it that I still like, which is a subsection of anarchism, the rest of it is a machine metaphor, and I cannot be dissuaded from that, right? And so when the stuff you're talking about and the need for cults, I kind of think about if you kept someone trapped in a basement for the first 5 years of their lives and only fed them Doritos. And then, like, you don't feed them for a week, and then you let them out, and there in the living room above your basement, there's a bag of Doritos and, say, an apple. They'll eat the Doritos because they don't know that that's basically not food, right? Let's say Cheetos or something, right? They don't know that the apple is food. They don't know that the apple is medicine, because they've only had Cheetos, they've only had Doritos. And I think like the UFO mania has always been, but certainly at the moment it's more obvious. Someone who is hungry for contact with the upper realms eating the Doritos. It's like,
Yep.
It's still fucking food.
Yeah,
but it's not like, no. Just move your eyes to the left. See that
to the
round
left a
thing?
little.
Yeah.
Yep.
Same thing
Definitely.
with transhumanism, same thing with all of that. Like, I get it, you're just doing it wrong. You're eating the Doritos because you've been trapped in a basement by the system, by, Globocap or whatever you want to call it. You've been stuck being fed something that has kept you alive that you think is food or reality, but it isn't. It's not. I think, so for you, because the Jung stuff, we've been talking or using a lot of Jungian framing so far, did you find Jung early on, or were you looking for a frame that's like, I need something better than just, when I say just, it's still valuable work, critiquing identitarianism for the idiocy that it is. I need something better. I need I can't just tear down the Doritos framework. Like, I need to find the Apple framework. And did you find Jung on that journey? That's the first, how early on was it? So tell me the story of finding Jung. That's the first bit. The second bit of that question is what I asked J.F. Martel the other week. Why, it's a leading question, why does the left hate Jung so much?
So, yeah, I can't wait to dig into that.
Go for it.
I'm hungry. Okay, so I guess I found Jung early on as like a teen, but obviously I understood Jung in like this very kind of dilettantish, basic way that most teenagers would understand Jung. And back then I was more sort of interested in the interpersonal dimensions of analytical psychology, and also ignorant to the occult roots of analytical psychology as well. And it wasn't until later on in life where I kind of put two and two together. And I guess my kind of foundation in Jungian thought introduced me to ideas like the shadow, like the ego and its functions, the notion of the collective unconscious, which had kind of informed my work in the political realm to begin with, and also highlighted some of the pathology that I was seeing unfolding in the political realm. Because I had that kind of foundation of knowledge, I could spot those pathologies pretty easily when I saw them. But what kind of led me to delve deeper into the Jungian paradigm was needing a deeper understanding and a better framework for the cultural pathologies that I was seeing manifesting themselves in front of me. Things like, political polarization, things like really hyper onlineness and atomization among young people, phenomena like inceldom, fanceldom, this sort of typical antisocial behaviors that you see proliferating themselves because of online culture and the effect that it's had on human consciousness. I really desperately felt like the materialist model didn't yield enough to explain these more transpersonal and abstract dimensions. And the Jungian paradigm kind of gave me the framework I needed to analyze and explain the cultural maladies that I was seeing, to name them, And there's like a power in being able to name something and to being able to name the phenomenon that's occurring in front of you. And as I started to delve deeper into the Jungian paradigm, I saw that Jung was not just a psychologist, he was a philosopher. He was kind of a phenomenologist in a lot of ways. He was an anthropologist, he was a mystic. I also started to see how some of his ideas that were rooted in mysticism informed analytical psychology, and how they were basically the foundations of analytical psychology, and how as above equals motherfucking below. And it kind of like blew my mind and gave me, I guess, the tools to explain what the hell is going on. And there is a sort of fragmentation going on currently, a disorientation of the cultural psyche. A kind of, Deleuze talks about schizophrenia. I know one of the things that Jung studied intently was schizophrenia, and it was what actually unlocked a lot of the keys to, things that he discovered, like complexes and all the different sorts of foundations within analytical theory. And there is kind of a distinct kind of schizophrenic way that the culture is behaving right now. The fact that we're untethered, the fact that our ego, the cultural ego, has no rooting, the kind of postmodern paradigm has like disoriented everything. We're going through this like technological acceleration. There's a crisis of meaning. The Jungian paradigm kind of gave me the philosophical, base, the phenomenological base, all of the different kind of bases that I needed to form a coherent picture of what's going on now. Not necessarily that I completely buy the entire Jungian paradigm, hook, line, and sinker, but it's sort of given me a basic foundation to kind of begin to unravel some of what I see occurring. So that was kind of what led me to Jung. Well, what led me full circle back to Jung in a more meaningful and profound way as an adult than like when I was a teen, kind of like learning about little concepts here and there. And then again, for why the left dislikes Jung, I really think that it's because the left is allergic to anything subjective, spiritual, transpersonal, anything. They see it as being in like competition with materialist analysis, which is not the truth.
And it's so funny, like it's being captured by a complex, because it's this fear of not being in complete control. The left requires total control. That's what
total
it is.
Control,
it's like,
total
even if they think it's for the right reason, that's a complex, right? Because Jung will tell you that actually very little is under control on a human basis. It gives agency outside of the ego to the whole cosmos, which is the opposite of what a left project is trying to do, which is to force the entire cosmos into becoming a more efficient 19th century factory. And so it's like they can't handle the idea that this critique, and also it's that imperial thing again of like, it's basically wizardry, which they don't like. For the same reason that like Jung will tell you that you live in like when you are captured by a complex, or if someone is captured by a complex, they're not them anymore. There are other beings, there are other agencies that are happening, right?
Yeah, and it literally feels like that. It does feel like you're dealing with a form of possession in a way. People lose their rational faculties. And I mean, because I was on the receiving end of a lot of hate, I had to kind of dissociate myself from it and realize that actually this isn't for me, and it's not necessarily coming towards me personally. This is something else. This is something else entirely that we're dealing with. The amount of fervor and the amount of hatred and the amount of, I guess, existential angst underneath the flailing shows that it's a lot deeper than just we wrestle against not flesh and blood, as the good book says. But then yeah, in that sense, the Jungian paradigm did give me the structure to be able to critique a lot of this stuff, to pinpoint what was going on, to name what was going on, and also to kind of criticize a lot of the pathology of the left, the primary force currently that's aligning itself with the good and the beautiful while ignoring its capacity for evil. And that's not to say the right doesn't do that. The right definitely does that. I mean, part of the right's pathology is they've always viewed themselves as like the quote unquote moral majority. despite the fact that they're, you know, the bastion of morality that's protecting culture against degeneracy and blah 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 blah. Despite the degenerates in their ranks, it happens. It's a tale as old as time, and the left also has the capacity for the same kind of misguided, egoic crusade. And yeah, the reason why they are reject the subjective is because, again, they view it as being in competition with materialist analysis. It kind of reminds me of the fight that the Dadaists had with the Communist Party in France during the height of the Dadaist movement. A lot of the Dadaists were sympathetic to the left. A lot of them were members of the Communist Party, but then the Communist Party chastised them for creating art that didn't serve this sort of utilitarian proletariat purpose. And it was Andre Breton who basically chastised, in this sort of famous polemic, he chastised the Communist Party, saying that the purpose of art is not to, you know, liberate the proletariat. The purpose of art is to interpret the human condition, and any mistake in that interpretation is a mistake in the interpretation of the universe, and therefore a hindrance to its transformation. Yeah. And I was like, he must have been a Mason, or maybe he was into some occult stuff, because that to me says as above, so below. Like, interpreting the human condition is in and of itself understanding the universe. It's attempting to comprehend the universe. And if you get in the way of that process, if the ego gets in the way of that process, you can't transform anything. And if the goal is to transform, then you can't get in the way of the process of understanding what it is that you're trying to transform. And the left ended up losing out. They ended up alienating the artists, alienating the bohemians, alienating those who had that transformative, transpersonal spiritual power, the ability to tap into the psyche, into the collective unconscious. And, you know, a lot of those artists ended up going to the right. Like after Dadaism, you know, kind of fizzled out, the surrealist movement came along. Dali came along, who was then affiliated with the fascists, because, you know, the fascists were far more open to the concept of art. They were far more open to the concept of heroic individualism and all of those different things. And therefore, they were sort of able to absorb those cultural energies. And I see the same thing happening currently. Like, the right has a far more dynamic art space. They're a lot more, you know, accommodating to dissident thought. You know, they're, you know, way more effective at communicating with the masses. They basically control and dominate memetics in that sense, especially online. The left has just kind of ceded all of this ground, all of this territory, and I definitely see the pendulum swinging in that direction now.
Absolutely.
And the left has no one to blame but itself.
Yeah, and I'm super concerned about, like, in the transhumanism solo show, depending on when this comes out, this will probably be a couple of weeks from the time of recording, I have some concerns about it, because one of the things, when I had a guy, Lee Morgan, traditional witch, lives up the valley from me, down here on the show about 5 or so years ago, who's talking about why he moved to Tasmania. And he said, I kind of see, not exactly for this, but he said one of the things that I think is going to happen is the witch trials are going to return. I didn't see that. But it turns out he's right. Yeah. It turns out when the left can only do remade Disney movies and endless Marvel films that get single-digit Rotten Tomato responses, which means they are so unwatchable that people flee in the opposite direction. The trouble with the opposite direction is that it does have witch hunts, right? And we're kind of there now. We're kind of there with what the pushback to, I mean, this is alive in the culture at the moment, but the show will come out later. Like, the Target situation isn't great. And it isn't great because if the bomb threats, if that's actually a true story, and it might not be, but if it turns out that LGBT groups are threatening to bomb working class retail employees, like, Target is a store that no one wants to shop at or work at, and you're threatening to bomb it because they took away some clothing that they were selling in an area that's like, I think about this as not just offensive to Christians, it's offensive to Muslims. Aren't they a protected group for identitarians, right? The Satan pronoun shirts and whatever. It's like, okay, the incorrect response here, coming back to being captured by complexes, is to threaten to bomb retail employees.
Yep.
And this doesn't end well for, shall we say, my team, quote unquote. Like, this doesn't end well for, if your goal is trans acceptance, don't threaten to bomb retail employees. And this is kind of what happened. Like, this is coming back to the witch hunt, abandoning of culture, abandoning of because the left only knows how to do, especially when it's losing, one thing, which is to double down on, okay, I'm going to do another series of rings of power and call everyone who doesn't like it racist. And it it empowers a side that will do that moral majority witch hunt stuff. And I'm not sure if that can be stopped anymore. I don't know. What are your thoughts on where or how we intervene, given that my side or our side is doing some things that I literally think are detrimental to long-term goals?
Yeah, I mean, for me, my ego is completely detached from any side at this point, or the need to sort of identify with any side. I represent and follow my own essence. That's kind of how I view it. So I don't necessarily feel moral culpability or responsibility for the machinations and excesses of the left. I feel like the people who get caught up in that cultural current are responsible for themselves.
Yeah.
I think that the best that I can do is attempt to draw attention to these things. And I think that those of us who understand what's currently happening have the responsibility to not conform, to speak up, to use our voices, to ensure that we're doing our best to arm people with the tools to unpick these harmful paradigms. But that's pretty much all you can do when you're dealing with a complex. Like you said, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And, you know, I as much as I have an interest in Jungian stuff and like analytical psychology, I'm also not a professional. I don't know how to deal with mass formation psychosis. All I can do is try to create little islands of sanity for now and attempt to reach those who have ears to listen. But in terms of the corrosiveness and the damage it's doing, yeah, one of the major feats of concern is the fact that it is empowering the right, the excesses of the right. Because I don't want to say the right in general, because the right kind of includes people like my family, for instance, who are, you know, Christians. And I don't necessarily think that they're bad people. They're working class people like everyone else. They just happen to have a different philosophy and, you know, certain cultural and social values that differ from my own. But we do live in a society that is supposed to accommodate that kind of thing. And I think we kind of have to start behaving like it. One of the major issues is that people forget that we live in a multicultural society and that multiculturalism entails some level of frisson and disagreement and also tolerance for such things, and that you don't get to just impose your beliefs on people.
Exactly.
The same way that, you know, a fundamentalist Muslim isn't allowed to force a hijab on me. You can't force them to think that homosexuality is a valid lifestyle if their religion is against it. But they have to abide by the laws of the country, meaning they can't discriminate, they can't do this, but they don't have to believe in their marrow that it's a valid lifestyle if they don't want to. That's what multiculturalism means. And also, that's what it should mean. And I feel like right now we're being encouraged not to view our societies or our neighbors as societies and neighbors. We're kind of in these weird, like, atomized groups. And it's gotten to the point where we're no longer looking out for our interests as a collective of people who are neighbors that live in nations that have multicultural identities. We're living as people who are in these sort of warring factions. And it's turned into this hideous, like, war of all against all, even though the problems that, like, affect us are ones that are collective and that require our collective attention. It's become absurd and dangerous at this point. And
Very
I guess
dangerous.
very incredibly dangerous. People are so blinded to what's actually important because they're kind of siphoned off into these, like, weird atomized little consumer demographics that they've
Well, that's the
that they
fucking
kind of,
identitarianism replaces individualism with consumerism, right? Like
yeah,
it's a communism based on behaving as an undifferentiated consumer. So it's this
consumer.
weird, yeah, it's this weird system, and that's what you're talking about there. I remember years ago, because he didn't do a good job of the last 3 years either. Nassim Taleb, who wrote Black
Mm,
Swan amongst other things, did a study of the cities in the Middle East essentially prior to the formation of Israel, because he says, how are we getting this wrong now when these cities are 5,000 years old? And in that time, they started off pagan, but then they've had Christians, Jews, and Muslims living together for millennia without the shit that's going on now. I mean, the subtext to that is American imperialism, 20th century, blah, blah, blah. But the point is well made, which is that what we call multiculturalism is essentially an erasure of difference, just like everyone just be a consumer. That's just
yeah,
what it is.
yeah,
But the trouble is,
yeah,
and this is that the left failing, right, or the identitarian failing, difference exists, and what
yeah,
cities used to do beforehand is understand that differences exist and align more around their commonalities, so that you would be, if you were Jewish, you'd be friends with the Muslims or Christians or whatever, maybe not best friends, but you wouldn't actively hate them. And if your city was attacked, you would fight beside them, because there
fight
are
them.
commonalities, which is we
Yeah,
live in this city, but there are differences, which is like you have a slightly different understanding of God to me, or whatever it happens to be. And we used to know how to
definitely.
do it,
Yeah,
right?
being from Nigeria, for instance, where half the population is Muslim and the other half is Christian. I had Muslim neighbors. Like my dad is Muslim, my mom is Christian. There's always been that sort of weird between two worlds, and the ways that these different cultures, despite their and religious affiliations, despite their distinctness, are still able to kind of relate to one another based upon the fact that they have this shared identity as Nigerians, despite the fact that the Nigerian identity is an imposed colonial identity because it didn't exist before those times. It's sort of been this kind of half that has managed to keep these disparate kind of warring tribes together at certain periods in history. And like you said, neoliberalism says we're all the same, not in any meaningful way, not in any sort of you're embedded in this community, in this social group that has certain social benefits. No, no, no. You're a consumer, and that's your identity. And can you blame the right for kicking against it?
Oh,
I mean,
totally.
a lot of the critiques that the right make about multiculturalism are correct,
They are
but
correct.
what the conclusions they come to are what I disagree with. Like their critiques of neoliberalism and the kind of disembedded, eroding factors of neoliberalism are 100% on the money. And what annoys me about the left is never willing to say there's anything wrong with the status quo. The left is always like, no, 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 the status quo is actually fine, and you're the one who's crazy for thinking there's anything wrong with this. Whereas the right seems to be the only place where critiques of the status quo are tolerated. And like you said, that's the reason why Jung is kind of embraced on the right. Like Jordan Peterson has become like the biggest kind of, poster child for Jung currently. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's like the only way that some people engage with Jung's ideas. Like, agree with Jordan Peterson, disagree with him, whatever, in terms of actually popularizing this form of thought. I'm glad that somebody is doing it.
Totally.
I'm glad.
And his
I'm also,
Jungian stuff, like, sorry to interrupt, but I, if you go back to his early videos where he's just this slightly overweight, passionate Canadian lecturer talking about Disney films, they're really good.
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah,
before Pronoun Gate, they're really good, and it's because he's the psychology professor who really likes Jung and Disney films, at least the classic ones. And I remember when he came on the scene. I did a solo show maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where cultures get the heroes they deserve, and that's what I have to say about Jordan Peterson. We deserve him,
yeah.
and I mean that in every sense. We get the heroes we deserve, and that's one of the like. I almost, this is such a good example, right? There's so much good stuff in his Jungian thing, but then he'll do something like bully Elliot Page on Twitter, and then when he gets heat for it, say, "Oh, can't we must think of the children?" Like it had something to do with, which most people would agree with. Like we're doing the trans kids thing wrong, but that has nothing to do with Elliot Page, who's just this like trans guy in his 30s who doesn't have kids. Like, come on, now. Like, this is that. He needs to get off Twitter. It's what's fucking happening. But it's this
Yeah, I
example
mean,
of like, where do we intervene? And one of the things that I think culturally, or no, individually within this context we're living through, is every person needs to find what replaces tribe as an idea rather than like pick another tribe, so that you don't end up leaving the left and 6 months later go, oh shit, I went from
I,
dank memes to like far right or whatever. And
but
you
that's the
can
thing. I
blink.
think we need to transcend two things. And I think this pathology can be found on both the right and the left. I think number one, we need to transcend our like need for tribe in general. Jung kind of talks about it in these three stages of consciousness and like differentiation. So, we were in the collective unconscious state of like the pleroma, and then we sort of differentiated from that and emanated out into the realm of creation, and the ego was born, and through that, civilization, gods, tribes, all of these different things became anchors for our psyches. But now, like in the burgeoning age of Aquarius, we have to leave behind the tribe and the collective identity in order to individuate. And I think that that's kind of the trial that's ahead of everybody in the 21st century, is the process of individuation, the process of kind of leaving behind, not forever, because obviously community is important, but you have to go on that hero's journey and then return to your community with your alchemical gold, which is kind of like the hero's journey arc. The hero sets out on a journey, has these experiences, gets in touch with their depths, unearths the gold, and then returns back to the community as an individuated participant. And I feel like the reason why communities now and affiliations now are so dysfunctional is because you're dealing with a collection of individuals who are not integrated, who are not individuated, who are kind of relying on each other and relying on whatever kind of loosely cobbled together paradigm they've managed to kind of sling together to kind of hold them together as like the glue that binds them. And this is a very unstable, a very kind of fleeting form of connection. I think that both, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, no matter where you stand culturally, I think that the journey that lies ahead of most people now is like one of temporarily disengaging from familial origins, tribal affiliations, political affiliations, whatever, and getting to the root of like who they truly are, and then sort of returning back to those things as more whole individuals. And secondly, I think heroism is dead. And I think this is more of a message for the right than it is for the left, but the left kind of has this issue unconsciously too. I think that the age of heroism is dead. I think that a different form of heroism is being born. People associate heroism with revenge, with slaying one's enemies, with gaining dominance and control, with, defeating the dragon. But the heroism of the Aquarian age, I think, is the reconciliation of opposites.
Yeah.
The true heroes, the true, badasses of now are the people who are capable of doing that. The people who are capable of individuating and capable of reconciling opposites. And that's not as glamorous or as sexy as slaying one's enemies or revenge, which is why it's like a path that very few are gonna be willing to take. But I feel like it's the only way. It's part of the reason why I'm so obsessed with the A Song of Ice and Fire series, the Game of Thrones series
It's
by
awesome.
George R.
It's better than
Yeah,
Game of Thrones.
yeah, it's way better. But the reason I'm obsessed with it is because he's telling a different kind of hero story. It's not one where, there are clear cut villains and clear cut heroes. It's almost like a hero's journey for the Aquarian age. And the true heroes of that story are the ones who are able to reconcile the opposites. Like one of the main characters of the story, Jon Snow, he's highborn, but he's also a bastard. He's got northern blood, but he's also a Targaryen. He, was a ranger at the wall, but then also spent time and fell in love with a wildling woman, the people who he's supposed to be responsible for keeping out, the people who are seen as other. He goes into that world and becomes part of it and immerses himself in it. And that's what makes him a hero, not the killing of his enemies, but the fact that he's able to kind of wear them, become them, inhabit them, understand them. And that urge is so missing on the left. It's nowhere to be found. And I think it's because we're still stuck in this old paradigm of heroism and what heroism means. And we haven't fully come to terms with what heroism means in a time such as this. And yeah, I feel like it's the responsibility of spiritually minded people to provide medicine for the current zeitgeist, because
Yeah.
we're in an emergency, and like all the things that we learn and unearth can be of great use in times such as this.
Oh, it reminds me. I know what you mean about the left having heroes differently, right? It's like the right has heroes, the left has saviors, and both are like wrong.
Yeah, yeah,
Both are like an old
yeah.
cosmology. It's sort
It's
of
an old cosmology,
got me
yes.
thinking of Donna Haraway and Ursula Le Guin, because Donna Haraway expands tremendously on Ursula Le Guin's much, I mean, obviously 20th century, but nevertheless much more Aquarian, much more female, much more yin understanding of heroism or post-heroism. And I'm not sure, because the thing I maybe like the least about Jung is his emphasis on reconciliation of opposites. And it's just like an animist irritation, where I would just describe it slightly differently to say a restoration of coherence. Do you know what I mean? Or like right relation? Because the thing I don't like about, I know what he means alchemically, but a healthy functioning rainforest isn't a reconciliation of opposites. It's like a coherence. Do you know what I mean? And so I know it's there. It's just every time he gets to it, I'm like, I that in a
I think
funny
it's
way
like
that
I think it's like the solve et coagula
yeah,
thing, like that you were referring to earlier, rather than like just deconstructing, doing the coagula process of alchemy and like reconstructing, building up, taking elements of things that seem disparate and combining them into new elements, which is kind of how I see it. But I also see how it may seem overly dualistic or might clash with other forms of philosophy. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like at the core it's all the same thing though.
oh totally.
Like
So like to reconcile the opposites is to birth a coherence, right? Like it's
yeah.
just yeah, it's one of those irritants for me personally, rather than anything else. Whenever I hit it, I'm like, and it's funny because one of the things that the left will critique him on, which is deeply unfair, just because he fucking died in the mid 20th century, right? So when they talk about the animist stuff as if he would be anti-trans, and I'm like, I don't think you've got that right. I
Oh,
think
stop it.
if he had another fucking 70 years to build his animus ideas, he might actually have the thing that can save the divisions, to dissolve them even, in
I
the
even
pro and anti-trans thing.
I even think personally that part of the reason why it's irreconcilable is because a lot of the leftist kind of view of gender is warped, in all honesty.
It's
And
materialist. It's like
yeah,
definitionally wrong.
and
Yeah.
it also rejects the concept of totality. Like Jung did kind of sort the whole gender thing out if you read his work. And the
If you
idea
read him
is
with
that
good faith, right? Because what people do is read him with bad faith and
yeah,
go, "Oh, he's an essentialist.
or
you
they
know."
might just disagree and that's fine. You might disagree and that's fine, but he did make his position clear, and his position, is what, like, analytical psychologists go by and all of this stuff. But basically, the current frame of gender is really persona, and and by identifying as a thing, you're rejecting the totality of your being, and you're really just creating and like performing a persona, which is the reason why the current gender paradigm isn't congruent with the Jungian paradigm. According to the Jungian paradigm, the soul is androgynous.
Exactly.
Everybody contains elements of masculine and feminine within them, but we exist in the realm of creation, and in the realm of creation, sexual dimorphism is real. And just because sexual dimorphism is real doesn't mean that people can't express themselves differently in terms of like personality. But we can't reject sexual dimorphism or pretend as if it doesn't exist, or pretend as if it doesn't have any psychological relevance. And, this is part of the issue of the left, is a lot of, the cultural truisms that are being pushed are pathological and lead to further fragmentation and further issues with the ego, further divisions of the psyche, rather than embrace and an embrace of wholeness. And once you label yourself, you're rejecting your totality, rejecting your wholeness. You start becoming trapped in performing a persona rather than really getting to the bottom of the totality that is your very being. And I think that the Jungian paradigm on gender is actually a lot more freeing and liberating.
Totally. Because it actually does, being non-physical, being like not materialist is a better way of saying it. It allows for the fact that like I really do have an anima in me. Like that's a real part of me. And for some people that will express more than for others. And you have an animus, and that like that's actually real. Like that's not mere words. Do you know what I mean? But if we have to argue gender expression in materialism, we lose, and we lose rightly so in some respects, like having biological men in women's prison raping prisoners. Like
Yeah.
that's what happens when the left gets stuck in materialism and is forced to defend nonsensical boundaries rather than go, wait a minute, our underlying philosophy is wrong.
Yeah.
What we
More
want to do here. Yeah, exactly. And
it's more
the most
it's
like
constant.
modern left thing is to argue, oh no, we should definitely put biological men in women's prisons rather than critique prisons, which is what a utopian left position thing should fucking do. Anyway.
But even then, it's even gotten to the point now where I remember reading, it was this theatre group that had put on a performance of Joan of Arc, and they were claiming that like Joan of Arc is like a non-binary, for instance, or some sort of non-binary icon. And I found that offensive, because why is it that if a woman steps out of her social role and decides to do something more traditionally masculine, then that means she ceases to be a woman? Does that mean that every woman in history who stepped out of her social role and did something more traditionally masculine was actually non-binary and isn't a woman anymore? It creates a more essentialist view on gender, which is the reason why I kind of reject the current left paradigm on gender, because it's incredibly essentialist, and it does focus more on creating a persona, a performance of gender, rather than like accepting the totality of what human beings actually are. And acknowledging sexual dimorphism existing in nature doesn't mean that you're rejecting the totality of me as a human being simply because I acknowledge that I'm a woman, simply because I'm an adult human female. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me, and it's become one of those major pressure points of conformity, where if you don't swallow it hook, line, and sinker, if you view it as a form of cultural malady or whatever that needs to be addressed or discussed, you're automatically viewed as a villain, you're automatically ostracized, or automatically demonized as well. You're automatically also chastised as far right, despite criticism of this big issue not being exclusive to right-wing people. Like, there are a lot of people who are not right-wing by any standard who have issues with this paradigm. It's become a mess, and I think it points to like deeper issues, a deeper yearning to experience again the numinous, the transcendent, something beyond the ego, something unifying. There is a discomfort with the level of fragmentation that we are currently experiencing on an unconscious level. And I think that, the gender, debates and all that, it's like the urge to unity, or the urge to kind of transcend physicality, transcend the limitations of the physical realm or whatever, but in a very warped way. And what I want to kind of communicate to people is that there are ways to do that. There are ways where you can get in touch with that higher spiritual realm, where things like race, things like gender cease to matter. But the way that people are currently going about it is incredibly warped and pathological. But it's hard for me to be contemptuous, because I do understand where the urge is coming from. And I'm also really sad that the current culture we have doesn't provide people with healthy outlets for these ancient primordial urges that will always be with us.
No, exactly, and it's because it's classic Jungianism. This entity, this archon that is the left, right? This control being, this Sauron thing. It can't admit the numinosity of the universe, so it only allows certain expressions. So it's like the divine androgyne is returning; it's closer to the surface. But if you're stuck in materialism, you end up calling in bomb threats to target.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
you've fucking done this wrong. It's
yeah,
just this, and it's not a denial of. It's so fascinating to me. The most powerful country in recorded history is going to get a divorce over the clothing choices of children's entertainers. Like that is amazing. In 100
yeah,
years' time, when history students are looking at that, they're like, "Come on, that didn't happen."
yeah,
It's like, no, it 100% did. America gets a divorce over clothing lines at Target and drag queen story hour. That's
yeah.
amazing. Well, like
Amazing.
on a Jungian perspective, that's amazing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, he would have a field day if he was alive currently, for sure. And it's almost absurd, but it's where we are at. But then again, I have to take comfort in the fact that like this has happened in history before, maybe not in this current form, but there have been many instances of like mass formation psychosis, or cultural maladies, mimetic hazards that have gotten out of control. The witch hunts was one of those instances. The atrocities of the 20th century also showcased what happens when the ego of any sort of political movement claims that it's the sole bastion of the good and the beautiful. Like, we've seen the result of what happens. Like, it brings to mind something like George Orwell's 1984. I hate to sound cliche or like cheesy, but we can create hell. We're very capable of creating hell. We're very capable of creating systems of conformity, of ignoring our capacity for evil, of following ego driven ideals into oblivion. I like Jung said this one thing in this clip that is always constantly going viral, and it didn't really hold much profound significance for me up until now, but he said that there is no great danger outside of man and his psyche. Man is the great danger, and all the great threats that we feel are facing us are engendered by our psyche. And that the fact that we don't know as much as we should about the psyche of man is a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And we really ought to take this a lot more seriously than we currently are. We really have the capacity to create hell, not just for, ourselves, but for generations and generations to come. The systems we create oftentimes, develop minds of their own. We sometimes live by unconscious habit. It's easy for our senses to become dulled by societal pressures, by the pressures of our peers. The banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt talks about. These things don't just show up, like monsters with their teeth bared. It's like this kind of gradual process of like moral erosion and apathy that creates evil in the world. And right now, as things are going, especially with the kind of culture the left is engendering, I see things getting very dangerous. Like you said, bomb threats are being called in. Anywhere where there's resentment and grievance, that's where evil
No,
festers.
nothing is more modern left to me than calling in a bomb threat on the working class. Like, I
Yeah,
just, nothing is more modern left to me than that. I'm
modern left
astounded.
in a nutshell. Modern left in a nutshell. But again, this is what happens when the ego identifies with the good and the beautiful. It creates the evil and the ugly. Once you're like, I'm so morally righteous that no matter what I do, it's justified, that's when evil begins to kind of fester and engender itself within you. And anybody can fall prey to that. But it's this realization that like we're human and we're fallible, number one. And no matter how morally righteous you think you are, no matter how aggrieved you are, you're not immune to resentment and all of the demons that resentment carries. And one of the major issues with the left is that it's become a cult of resentment. And that's like the major demon that's like feeding on it at the moment, is resentment, and people using it as an outlet for their personal resentments against society, against their families of origin. You know, it's not necessarily about improving anything, because if you're really invested in improving things, you should want that even for the people you disagree with, even for the people who harmed you, even for the people who you dislike. But what I see is resentful people who have this will to power, and they want to attain power in order to punish and disenfranchise those who they feel have harmed them, those who they feel are less deserving. And that is what creates evil in the world. Every person who we see as evil now is somebody who thought they had a grievance and got power and decided to use that power to right whatever historical wrong they felt needed righting. And the fact that people on the left can't see themselves as ever being in that position, despite all we've been through, the 20th century, cults, all kinds of things. There's documentaries all over Netflix about cults, cult programming. All you think that people would get, you think people would understand it by now. You think people would actually have some semblance of human nature and its pitfalls. But we just seem to keep doing the same damn thing over and over and over again. And the same pattern is repeating itself in the modern left, which has its levers on serious institutional power in Silicon Valley, in security agencies, in the media, in all kinds of areas that like have a major impact on our lives. And they're moving forward with an ethos that's incredibly dangerous and incredibly corrosive. And it's something that needs to be taken incredibly seriously. And this is what I've learned from my almost, 5-6 years of immersion in the political realm, in spiritual realms, with prominent figures on the left. I've seen the belly of the beast, and we're in an emergency situation.
There's something, I know you've been reading some Robert Anton Wilson of late, and one of the things that I returned to one of his pithy observations is that the right is correct about governments and the left is correct about corporations. And so one of the questions I asked Reed when he was on the show was, does he identify as post-left now? And he said, if anything, he identifies as pre-left, which I quite liked. I thought that was it's like an important reframing because it puts us back in that genuine community, living cosmos idea of a sort of anarchism, right? Like the best books about, like Kropotkin would study the Holy Roman Empire because for almost 1,000 years, much of Europe lived without kings, essentially. They just kind of got on together in communities, right? And so I like that answer, but I'm going to ask you the same question. Like, how would you describe your political home now?
I don't, which is the thing. I actually like to keep it purposefully vague and mysterious, especially because the sort of the conventions of like the online realm, which sort of incentivizes people towards appealing to a specific tribe or specific affiliation in order to build their audience, in order to kind of cultivate people's identities, in order to signal to the right people. Like, you look in people's Twitter bios and you see their political affiliation, their pronouns, their this, their that. I tend not to kind of, I guess, advertise myself in that way or approach public consciousness in that way, because I really don't think it matters. I think if people pay close attention enough to my work, they can see where my convictions lie and what I may be more closely affiliated to. But it's not something I necessarily feel I need to lead with, because I feel like it, number one, alienates people. Number two, it categorizes you in a way that annihilates you in certain people's eyes. And number three, it kind of prevents you from being able to reach people in a more like holistic fashion. And like I said, I'm really willing to talk to anybody who's willing to listen. And I don't want anything to be in the way of that. So I tend not to identify as anything. I'm led by my essence. And I feel like when people identify with things, they become tribal. And when they become tribal, they stop supporting things because it's what's right. They start supporting things because it's what aligns with their tribal team. I mean, I saw this during, COVID, when, they were threatening to fire workers because of mandates, which is something that the traditional left would not have aligned itself with at all. But because the converse position was associated with right-wing conspiracy theories and chuds or whatever the hell else, they abandoned their principles in order to be tribal. They didn't affiliate themselves with what was right because the tribe demanded otherwise. I'm more interested in orienting myself towards what I feel is right and good, rather than what I feel I'm bound to because of some political affiliation. So I guess the short version to the answer is I really don't care. Like I don't care at this point. People call me right wing, people call me left wing, people on the right call me, a communist, people on the left call me a reactionary. I get labeled all sorts of things. I know who I am, I know what I'm about, and I align myself with what comes out of my essence and what I feel is right. And I think that that's enough. And I think that everything else is just kind of marketing spiel in order to gain access to certain demographics.
Absolutely old story stuff, right? Like left, right is literally 18th century. We all know that. So I'm sneeringly dismissive of not the person, but the position that suggests that's at all important, particularly today when any departure from neoliberal capitalism, COVID being a very good example, because it wasn't even just like they should be defending workers. It's like they fell in line with a ludicrous idea of scientism that supports the most corrupt corporations on earth.
Corporations on earth.
What the fuck are you doing? But so anyway, but if you depart from that, you get called far right. So I've been in the same situation.
Yeah.
So it's like, I get called alt right, except when I talk about stuff like this, and there'll be people in the YouTube comments saying you're trying to appear too left, or you're worried that people won't think they're left. And I'm like, well, which fucking one is it?
Disregard all of it, and anybody who's on the path of the soul. And I think that the answer to the question is individuation, and for soulfulness to reassert itself within the culture. And anybody who's on that path is disregarding the direction-brained nonsense of like YouTube comment section dwellers and people who are kind of infected with that mimetic virus. I think really and truly you have to disregard it and just sort of plow ahead. What you are will reveal itself through your work, your affiliations, and what you do. Like, we're in a world where people think identifying equals being. You're not what you identify as, you're what you fucking do. I don't give a shit about what you identify as. Like, what the fuck is the point of me calling myself a communist? Where the fuck is the Communist Party? Where is the fucking political outlet for that shit? Like, it makes no sense. You're not what you identify as, you're what you do. You can have certain ideological affiliations or, things that you're inspired by or philosophies that you are more disposed towards, but you can't go around calling yourself things if there's no real meaningful way in which you engage in that. And it comes from this like disembodiment. We're all so online, atomized, disembodied. The realm of experience is sort of closing down more and more. Things are becoming more and more digitized. People are living their identities digitally now. So there's this like weird disconnect between like reality, the reality of people's lives, and their sort of subjective ideological identities. And it's created a very, 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 very toxic mentality with people on the left who have long lists of identifiers. But then when you actually look at their lives are empty. When you look at the realm of experience, all they are atomized consumers. It's really, really, really pathological, which is the reason why I'm like, no, don't play that game. If somebody wants to call you right wing, let them. If somebody wants to call you left wing, let them. It doesn't fucking matter at the end of the day. What matters is what you do. Exactly. And that's kind of...
You said it earlier, like on an individual basis, what is right for you? Like, I'm just going to do and say the things that are right. And it's a prayer I've been sitting with the last year or so is what is mine to do? So it's like where, rather than, and it's a medicine for the leftist thought form, which says I must perfect all of reality. Like I must submit it to the right moral position, the correct moral position. What is mine to do is like, well, just drop in internally and like what am I supposed to do where it's not what can I do, but like where can I intervene, what is mine to do. And I really like what you said there about like I'm just going to move, when I say move towards the right, like move towards the right thing to do. That's my politics are, what do I think is the right thing to do?
Yes, yes.
Seems like
It's really that simple. It's really that simple. And I'm sad that the simplicity of that is like lost in all of this like nonsense. What do you think is right? What does your conscience tell you? What do you feel convicted by? You know, that's and outside of social pressure, tribal affiliation, family of origin, you know, political affiliation, what do you think is right? Because sometimes your tribe is going to say stuff that conflicts with your soul. Sometimes your political team are going to do things that conflict with your moral compass. And what you see nowadays is people sublimating that call from within in order to be totally outwardly driven. And it's destroying them. It really is destroying them. And this isn't just a problem of politics, it's a problem of identity, it's a problem of pop culture, it's a problem of technological utopianism and all of the different, again, secular spiritualities that are dominating our current moment. You know, it's this desire to evade the responsibility that one has for having a soul. And like I said at the beginning, all of the negative experiences that I've had in all of these different realms forced me into contact with my soul. And I realized that I'm a lot more sensitive now, and things have a lot more weight now. Like having a soul is like when you actually feel that in your body and in your spirit and in your mind, it's a very big, weighty thing. And it's not something to be taken lightly. And now that I realize that, I understand why people evade it, because it's a lot easier to go through life letting your ego dominate everything, letting your ego lead everything. But it's far more rewarding if you take that step aside and allow the soul to speak, allow the qualities that are beyond you, that were bestowed upon you, to express themselves, and understand that you're not fully in control of anything at all. And I
that's a
think that
lovely yeah.
yeah, sorry, yeah.
No, that's like a really powerful kind of like final statement about what you can do and the medicine that comes from going through the journey. So it's a really, really good place to wind it up. Any last thoughts before I ask where people can find you and what you got going on?
No, I'm good. I think I've rambled and gotten too passionate. Like,
No, it's been fun. It's been especially like yeah,
when
when you find people who are like, yeah, I know what a lot of that was like. It's
yeah,
a good
I know.
conversation to have.
It's nice to talk to other people who understand it as well, because that's very rare for me, which is probably why I get like animated, because for the most part I'm going through the motions alone, which I'm used to now, and I really appreciate that experience because it's taught me a lot. But it's nice to be able to talk to people who have similar thoughts, have had similar experiences, and who are kind of attempting to struggle through this zeitgeist that we find ourselves in similar ways. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah. Anytime, anytime. But let people know what you got going on, where they can find you, all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have a podcast called Mystic in the Machine. We are on YouTube. We are also on Spotify. It's like a video podcast slash live stream. We talk tech, pop culture. We talk, you know, cultural events and cultural commentary, similar to kind of like what I'm doing now. And I also have a YouTube channel called Angie Speaks as well. I make video essays on there about, you know, topics to do with the zeitgeist, politics, culture, all of that stuff. And you can find me on Twitter at SpeaksAngie.